Brittany, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here on the show. Obviously, we're in the middle of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and these new contact tracing capabilities open up a lot of possibilities to contain the crisis, but also raise new issues. What are your thoughts on contact tracing given the specific goal to contain a pandemic?
I think we're all in this together, that we want to be able to save human life in the midst of a global pandemic. So just like we all have decided to stay at home, we've decided to obey other regulations to quarantine ourselves, we should also be interested in using contact tracing so that vulnerable people can be warned if they have been exposed. The main problem is that many of the big companies and governments that are implementing contact tracing apps don't have a great history of respecting data protection and privacy. And the governments that are encouraging people to opt into these apps have not implemented data protection legislation or regulation that will protect citizens' privacy and how their data is going to be used.
You've been working with New York on an emergency bill that was introduced to state Congress about how to regulate contact tracing data. What are you proposing?
We're proposing that people have a clear and explicit opt-in so that they understand what they are giving their data away for, how long it's going to be held, who is going to get access to it, what it can be used for, and if it's going to be monetized, that the individuals that have opted in would have some ownership over that value. We're also explicitly looking, for instance, because of the past week and a half or so, to ban law enforcement from getting access to that data. I think there's been a growing concern with the peaceful protests and violent riots that have broken out in hundreds of cities across the nation, whether or not law enforcement will be using contact tracing data in order to track protesters and perhaps prevent the peaceful attempt trying to make a difference.
You worked at Cambridge Analytica, which became a flashpoint over their misuse of user data that they got through a Facebook integration, potentially undermining the US presidential election. How has that experience informed your views about contact tracing and data privacy in general?
What I learned at Cambridge Analytica is that there's a big difference between what you can legally do with data and what you should ethically do with data, which is why I've been spending so much time working with legislators to prevent the abuses that I saw in the 2016 elections. So we are trying to implement new laws and regulations to make sure citizens are protected, but technology innovation can still go forward as long as it is done in an ethical and moral way. I obviously have a lot of quandaries that I've had to deal with in the past few years in this realm, and you can obviously read more about it in my book, Targeted. And if you've seen The Great Hack on Netflix, that also explains further why you cannot allow private companies or even governments to do whatever they want with personal data. We need to assert our rights in a legislative infrastructure that is easy for both companies and citizens to understand.
You've been speaking with regulators. What are they telling you?
Many regulators are concerned that if we make contact tracing apps explicitly opt-in only, that they're not going to get enough participation. And of course, I completely understand that. And I want the entire infrastructure of contact tracing to work in order to save human life. And that's why we're working very hard in order to balance the need for innovation in order to serve our medical and societal purposes with the need to protect our fundamental rights and freedoms.
Now, on that note, technological contact tracing sounds amazing in theory, but it's actually still a very hard technological problem to pull off. I mean, how much progress has actually been made in terms of doing this successfully? Like, will it really work at the end of the day anyway?
If we get enough citizen participation, then yes, it can work. There are multiple governments across the world who have had millions of people already opt in, and those individuals are successfully getting notifications if they have come into contact with somebody who is found to be COVID-19 positive. And I think that's a very great use of showing people that sharing their data can be safe, it can be for the public good, and there is a way to understand what it can and can't be used for. But again, a lot of these countries do not have laws that protect the citizens that opt in from their data being abused.
Now, meantime, speaking of other countries, you've got Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, Israel, France, all working on their own contact tracing apps. How would you compare their approach and the progress they've made to the United States, which has been kind of late to the game?
I would say that there are some governments that have never really respected the privacy of their citizens, where data ownership and data protection is not really a conversation. So those governments have been able to access data without getting the opt-in of citizens, which is not possible across Europe. It's not possible in the state of California, or really under the legislative frameworks that we in the US are working toward. So therefore, it's important that we can make sure to inform and make citizens aware of what these apps are.
In order for it to be pulled off technologically, Google and Apple, two big tech companies that also compete, have decided to work together in sort of an unprecedented partnership for contact tracing, specifically for COVID-19. Do you have concerns about that?
I have plenty of concerns about that. Obviously, on one hand, you can see how we're all in this together is the spirit of them finally deciding to work together. And if we can save human life through them collaborating for the first time, then that's a brilliant use of technology innovation. But of course, two companies that do not have a great history in terms of respecting privacy are now able to combine data sets that they have not been able to access before in the other company's firewalls. So I think it's incredibly important that we get through first in the state of New York, Senate Bill number 8448, as well as the federal legislation that has been introduced to Congress last week.
So on the Apple and Google partnership specifically, what do you think the biggest risks are?
I think the biggest risks are that Apple and Google especially have not yet taken seriously a lot of the problems that have come up in the past few years with protecting people from data targeting, data manipulation, fake news, and targeted disinformation. These are all issues that we have not fully addressed yet. So the idea that further personal information is going to be collected in an unregulated fashion should make not only the privacy community nervous, but any citizen that cares about their own right.
The Senate also has a new bill, bipartisan legislation called the Exposure Notification Privacy Act. What's your take on that? And do you think it meets sort of your concerns, or does it raise new ones?
I definitely think that it addresses some of the concerns that we've been working through in New York, but I don't think that it has adequately addressed the new issues that have come up over the past week and a half when we're dealing with the targeting of protesters. In our bill in New York, we deal with anti-discrimination, and we deal with the banning of law enforcement accessing that data when it's meant to be to prevent a further healthcare crisis. So once they can implement those types of protocols into it, then I will be very happy to endorse it publicly.